boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this story that grabbed a lot of people's attention in the sport of boxing, amateur boxing, and pro boxing about 2 weeks ago. USA Boxing, the national governing body for amateur and Olympic-style boxing, are now adding this transgender policy to their new rule book for 2024, which allows boxers who transition from male to female to compete in the female category under certain conditions. Conditions intended to make it an even playing field, though conditions that are still being met with resistance from female boxers, that is, those born with a pair of X chromosomes and not a pair of XY chromosomes.
What's the policy?
Minor boxers under the age of 18 must compete as their birth gender in weight classes outlined in the USA Boxing rulebook. USA Boxing will only communicate with minors with a parent or legal guardian present. For boxers over the age of 18, USA Boxing follows the guidance of the IOC's 2015 consensus meeting decision in Chand versus Athletics Federation in India and International Amateur Athletic Federation and the 2022 United States Olympic Paralympic Committee, USOPC, medical and scientific discussion pertaining to transgender athletes in sport, which cites studies from the Boston Children's Hospital Sports Medicine and Harvard Medical School Teaching Hospital. Normal range of testosterone for males is defined as more than 10 nanomoles per liter, and normal range of testosterone for females is less than 3.1 nanomoles per liter. A boxer who transitions from male to female is eligible to compete in the female category under the following conditions.
What?
The athlete has declared that her gender identity is female and has completed gender reassignment surgery. The athlete, for a minimum of 4 years after said surgery, has had quarterly hormone testing and presents USA Boxing documentation of hormone levels. The athlete must demonstrate that her total testosterone level in serum has been below 5 nanomoles for at least 48 months prior to her first competition, with the requirement for any longer period to be based on a confidential case-by-case evaluation, considering whether or not 48 months is a sufficient length of time to minimize any advantage in women's competition. The athlete's total testosterone level in serum must remain below 5 nanomoles throughout the period of desired eligibility to compete in the female category. And even with this rigorous testing regime,
people on both sides of the industry are against it. The fight fans, the fighters themselves, the people in boxing, the higher-ups.
Was the WBC's president, Mauricio Suleiman, via his own social media, who uploaded this image that states in so many words, only those born with XX chromosomes can compete against those with XX chromosomes. XX versus XX is alright, XY versus XY, but not XY versus XX.
He's against it. The fans themselves are against it, and they were less than diplomatic when expressing that discontent.
Making sure to read the room to get an accurate fix. Gauge how people really feel about this, and whether you're talking about the fans or the fighters themselves. Fighters like Ebony Bridges, who expressed her discontent vocally, alongside Senicia Estrada, Alicia Baumgartner, and some other female fighters, female athletes, which begs the question, if so many people in boxing are against this, then why is USA Boxing making this change to their policy? Who is it exactly that they're looking to accommodate? And it seems to me that they are satisfying the whims of the few at the expense of the many, which fiscally could have dramatic repercussions that could jeopardize the continued survival of women's boxing, because there's no audience for this. That is established. This is not something that the core supporters, the people who watch boxing, they're not asking for this.
You can't alienate the majority in favor of the minority and hope to survive, and rest assured, it's a minority we're talking about. It's a substrata.
There is an efficacy issue to be addressed, and many people feel that what USA Boxing is doing is allowing ideologues to swoop in and treat the sport like it's their own personal petri dish, to conduct their own social experiments, as this would be experimental. It's not been done before, and this isn't shooting a ball into a net or lifting a barbell over your head. This is a contact sport.
Boxing is a dangerous enough sport as it is without you allowing those born with XY chromosomes to come into contact with those born with XX chromosomes.
You're alienating the fighters who may be against this and the audience that takes stakes in amateur boxing, they're not going to want to watch that stuff. That's what they're saying. USA Boxing putting the whims of the few before the demands of the many, the majority, could jeopardize the survival of female amateur boxing. Not dissimilar from what we saw last year with Anheuser-Busch and how they decided.
They took it upon themselves to make Dylan Mulvaney the face of their brand, the face of Bud Light.
A trans TikToker and social media influencer, and as a result of that, they paid the cost. They paid the cost, all right. Their sales took a dramatic hit because Dylan Mulvaney is not an adequate reflection of their consumer base, of their customers, and trying to force feed them this costed them an estimated $395 million and counting. That was last year. Who knows how much it's costed them up until this point? They're still reeling. They're still recovering from that.
You have to know your customer. In the case of boxing, you have to know your audience.
And you may not have one if you continue down this road. That's the consumer perspective. From the fighter perspective, well, how many fighters do you see that are against this? And how many fighters are going to want to compete in women's amateur boxing if they have to come up against someone who was born with XY chromosomes instead of XX chromosomes?
Not many from what I'm seeing.
Which could result in not just declining viewership for women's amateur boxing, but declining participation. And that pairing could result in the death of women's amateur boxing. The conversation takes a very different shape and has a different complexion when you're talking about not having a sport to govern.
As the ideologues write up these policies that greatly alienate the participants.
These guidelines, as they were. You won't need them if nobody's watching and nobody's boxing.
If nobody wants to.
They're playing a dangerous game that jeopardizes how many female fighters are going to want to participate in the sport, as well as how many people are going to want to watch it, all to accommodate the whims of the few at the expense of the many. And they won't need guidelines moving forward if there isn't even a sport to govern. That's what they're gambling.
And that's just at the amateur level. At the pro level, there is no audience for this. There is no demand.
None.
Read the room.
Boxing is a business, and for any business that is a business, the lifeblood of the business is money. The money that patrons pay to continue to see a sport.
People aren't going to pay to see this.
They're against it. And without patrons patronizing a sport, because it's all entertainment at the end of the day, if they don't entertain it, then there is no money, and no money means no sport.
Very simple.
Would say that the people at USA Boxing need to think long and hard about what they're doing, but in their own mind's eye, they already have.
They must have thought that me and you were going to go along with this.
In men's heavyweight news, Zhang says Eddie Hearn won't let me anywhere near close to Joshua because he knows what will happen. It seems that Zhang still wants to settle the score with Anthony Joshua for what Anthony did to him in the amateurs. He hopes to avenge that loss in the pros. There is already talk of Zhang returning to the ring as part of the undercard to the heavyweight clash between Anthony Joshua and Francis Ngannou, which take place on March 8th in Saudi Arabia. I want to come back during March, and that's the plan. But if you're asking me who I want the next opponent to be, realistically, then I say Joseph Parker. But does he dare to fight me? I'm open to everything, but I am focusing on the gym and being in the ring for my return. I would like to have my next fight to be in Saudi Arabia, but everything is being worked on and is in the process. I can't say too much about it, Zhang said.
Joseph is a very different target, very different opponent, different assignment to the one that Zhang had last year. He's a very different guy to Joe Joyce.
Even if Joe Joyce beat Joseph Parker and Zhang beat Joe Joyce, that doesn't necessarily mean that Zhang would beat Joseph. In the sport of boxing, triangle theories don't work, and it's styles that make fights. Styles determine the outcomes.
Zhang's got his eye on Joseph Parker, but that's not the only guy he's got his eye on.
I think Anthony Joshua looked great, to be honest. He's found a way to deal with the southpaw, and this is probably due to his training with Ben Davison. And from the first round to the fifth round, where he knocked Valine out, he dominated every round. And it now means Joshua is coming back on track, and we can say that he's back. Zhang said, "I'll see what I do differently in the ring if I face Joshua, but let me tell you this, I have been trying to fight Joshua for years, and the fans have wanted it for years, but there are two people that don't want the fight to happen, and that is Eddie Hearn and Anthony Joshua. This has been proven again.
People never tell the whole story.
Zhang spent some time with Matchroom, and the time that he spent there, he wasn't a high-profile guy, didn't have any high-profile fights, he looked less than spectacular against the journeyman in Jerry Forrest, and it's only really in recent memory that Zhang managed to make a splash, and credit to him, because I think he's a formidable fighter, but I do think he's also being less than honest here. You make it seem like Anthony Joshua's been pussyfooting around all the formidable fighters all this time, when the last 2 or 3 years, pay attention to who he's been fighting. He fought his IBF mandatory challenger in Kubrat Pulev, that was in 2020, and he fought Alexander Usyk 2 times in the 2 years that followed.
That was his mandatory too, in the first fight in 2021, the same year that you stunk out the joint with Jerry Forrest. Was Anthony supposed to box you then? Give up his title to Alexander so he can fight you.
Who was asking for that fight? Zhang's last fight under the Matchroom banner was the Filip Hrgovic fight, and I will admit that he looked formidable in that fight. The problem is, you weren't with Matchroom anymore. You went over to Queensbury to get yourself a Joe Joyce fight that turned out to be a 2-fight engagement. Currently, they have options on Zhang. He's not done with Queensbury. Why would Anthony Joshua have him, of all people, on the brain?
In 2020, in 2021,
in 2022, he was busy with Usyk. In 2023, you were busy with Joe Joyce. You fought him 2 times that year, and you did real good for yourself. But why would Anthony have been focusing on you?
He was on the bounce, he was on the rebound, and you were over there at Queensbury.
Thus, when he says that he's been trying to fight Anthony for years, maybe he has, but you weren't on Anthony's radar. You really weren't on anybody's radar until last year. This year, there's a precedence for the fight. I'm not against it. I could go for it after the Ngannou fight. But if what Zhang thinks is he's going to do to Anthony what he did to Joe Joyce last year, Anthony's a very different fighter to Joe Joyce. He's not going to stand right in front of you, shoulders square, throwing punches and bunches so you can catch him in between. Anthony's a younger fighter than Joe Joyce, a lot more athletic, faster on his feet with faster hands.
And before you go thinking that he all of a sudden learned how to fight a southpaw based on the Valine fight, what do you think Charles Martin was? He was an unbeaten southpaw, an unbeaten champion with a hefty knockout percentage. Anthony took care of him years ago and made it look easy. Easier than Jared Anderson just made it look.
And easier than Luis Ortiz before him. Luis Ortiz was supposed to be some kind of boogeyman. He got sat on his back pocket, what was it, 2, 3 times? He had to go life or death with Charles Martin to find the W. Not writing off Zhang or dismissing him. I think he's a formidable fighter. I'm just addressing this notion that because you beat Joe Joyce, you think you're going to beat Anthony. Are Joe Joyce and Anthony the same person? Do they fight the same?
No, they don't.
It's a very different fight. How do we know that Zhang doesn't go back to looking the way that he looked with Jerry Forrest if you put him in there with Anthony Joshua? A moving target who's not going to stand right in front of you the same way that Joe Joyce did. A guy who's not going to make himself available for your counters the same way Joe Joyce did.
I'm just saying.
The truth is, Zhang is one of many fighters that wants to corner a fight with Anthony Joshua, and he may have wanted that fight for years, but he probably wasn't on Anthony's radar, and I know for sure he wasn't on the fans' radar. Not until recent memory, not really until last year. In any event, Anthony has bigger fish to fry. As Eddie Hearn says, I truly believe Anthony Joshua will become undisputed heavyweight world champion off the back of AJ versus Otto Wallin and Tyson Fury versus Francis Ngannou. You're telling me you don't fancy AJ against Fury? And here's the thing.
While Tyson Fury might be the fastest route to the undisputed crown for Anthony Joshua, that is contingent upon Fury making it past Alexander Usyk, and I'm not convinced he's going to.
I think Usyk's gonna beat him. And if Usyk does beat him, I'm not even sure Fury activates his rematch clause. I'm not even sure Fury's gonna want a second fight, depending on how the first one goes. Now, if it happens the other way around, and Fury beats Usyk,
I can see Usyk activating his rematch clause. I can see that turning into a 2-fight engagement, especially if the first fight results in a controversial decision.
I can see that. And that would, in effect, consume all of Tyson Fury's calendar year, the entire year in 2024, which means Anthony wouldn't get his crack at the apple until the following year in 2025. Now, by that time, Tyson Fury will be a much older man, closer to 40, whereas Anthony is comparatively younger, so time is on Anthony's side in that scenario.
You think Fury would fight him?
For the right price, for what the Saudis would pay him to do it, I think he would. I think that's a ginormous fight. You have to consider that Anthony may not get his hands on Fury this entire calendar year, but he might spend the year rebuilding his name and rebuilding his brand. He's coming off a sensational win over Otto Wallin, and if he takes care of business against Francis Ngannou the way I think he's going to, that lends itself to a Fury fight. If AJ can do the demolition job on Ngannou that Fury didn't do, that builds the Fury fight. Then he can take on Filip Hrgovic or Zhang Zhang, who we just talked about, in the summer months. Maybe cap off the year, the fall and winter months, with an easy one, a little maintenance fight, and meet Fury in the following year. I see Eddie Hearn's vision that it can happen, but it's all contingent upon Fury beating Usyk, and I'm not convinced he's going to do that. You didn't fight Derek Chisora and Francis Ngannou in that order.
You didn't do that for no reason. You had the audacity, the nerve, to cap off 2022 with a Derek Chisora trilogy, knowing you beat him already 2 times.
And you sat out most of last year in your phone negotiations with Alexander Usyk. You were giving that guy the runaround so you could walk right into a fight with a novice boxer, an MMA fighter who never actually boxed before. And we all saw how he looked.
That's the byproduct of being on Easy Street for too long.
I don't think he ever wanted that Usyk fight. I think all that stuff last year, that runaround he gave Team Usyk, it's because he didn't really want that fight. And the only reason he's doing it now is because the Saudis are paying him a fortune to do it. But here and now, based on Tyson Fury's habits and how he treats his body, how he's looked in his last 2 fights,
I don't think he makes it past him. I don't think he beats him.
the concern expressed by his father in tandem with how he's looked in his last 2 outings, in his last 2 fights, and how he treats his body, I'm not convinced Fury can beat this guy. I think Usyk's going to beat him, and if he does, Fury might retire on that. He might not make it to a Joshua fight, at which point if Alexander Usyk becomes undisputed champion, he might retire alongside him.
The belts will get redistributed, and a new crop of champions will sprout from the ground.
At which point, Anthony can become one of them, and the others beat some of them. I could see that. Filip Hrgovic via the IBF, Zhang Zhang by way of the WBO, for Christ's sakes, Manuel Char via the WBA. Yeah, Anthony can beat those guys.
He can become a 3-time unified champion. I could see it.